On January 15th, 1998, a photograph was taken that told an entire story without a single word. Indonesian President Suharto, one of the most powerful men in Asia for 31 years, ruler of the world's fourth most populous nation, sat hunched over a desk, pen in hand, signing an agreement with the International Monetary Fund. Standing directly behind him, arms folded across his chest, looking down at the signing like a headmaster watching a student write lines, was IMF Managing Director Michel Camdessus. The image ran on front pages around the world. Nobody had to explain what it meant. A man who had commanded armies, survived coups, and governed 200 million people was signing away his country's economic sovereignty to an institution based in Washington, D.C. And the man from Washington was not even trying to look gracious about it. 4 months later, Suharto was gone. Riots had broken out across Indonesia. Over 1,000 people died in the unrest. The Indonesian rupiah had lost 80% of its value. Unemployment had tripled. GDP had contracted by 13.1% in a single year. The IMF's rescue package, worth $40 billion, had turned a currency crisis into a full economic collapse. The IMF called it an unfortunate outcome. Jeffrey Sachs, director of the Harvard Institute for International Development, called it something less polite. The institution, he wrote in the Financial Times in December 1997, had dictated economic conditions to 350 million people across Asia and put more than $100 billion of taxpayers' money on the line based on prescriptions that were, in his view, making everything catastrophically worse. Joseph Stiglitz, then chief economist at the World Bank and later a Nobel Prize winner, agreed. He said the IMF was not participating in a conspiracy, and then immediately made it sound considerably worse than a conspiracy by adding that it was simply reflecting the interests and ideology of the Western financial community. I'm Malcolm. This is History Meets Economics, where every video will change how you see money, history, and the systems controlling your life. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because the IMF has been operating for 80 years. It has intervened in economies across Latin America, Asia, and Africa. It has managed crises in Europe. And the question that keeps surfacing among economists, among the countries that have been through it, and increasingly inside the IMF itself, is whether the rescue makes things better or whether it makes them worse. Has the IMF helped any country you know? Drop a comment below. We want to hear from people who have lived through one of its programs. The IMF was born in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire, where the Allied powers gathered to design the post-war financial architecture. John Maynard Keynes, who helped create it, described the original vision as an institution that would support countries facing temporary balance of payments crises, providing short-term liquidity so that governments did not have to devastate their economies to defend their exchange rates. It was, in principle, a good idea. A financial fire brigade, available to any country that needed emergency cash, no ideological agenda attached. For its first few decades, the IMF operated broadly within that vision, managing currency crises among industrialized countries, providing short-term support. It was a limited, technical institution. Then came the 1970s oil shocks, which left dozens of developing countries suddenly unable to service their dollar-denominated debts. Then came the 1980s Latin American debt crisis, which threatened to bring down the major American banks that had lent aggressively to the region. The IMF stepped into both, and in doing so transformed itself into something far larger and more interventionist than Keynes had envisioned. It was no longer managing short-term liquidity. It was redesigning the economic structures of entire nations, attaching conditions to its loans that reached into labor markets, tax systems, trade policy, and the ownership of state assets. The word temporary had quietly left the building. What it became is a different institution entirely. The first thing to know about an IMF rescue, the money rarely stays in the country receiving it. When a country approaches the IMF in crisis, it is almost always because it owes money to foreign creditors, banks, bondholders, and institutional investors, most of them based in London, New York, or Frankfurt. The country cannot pay. The currency is collapsing. Capital is fleeing. The IMF arrives with a loan. And here is the mechanism that most people do not fully understand. The IMF loan goes directly to repay those foreign creditors. Not to build hospitals. Not to fund schools. Not to stabilize the wages of workers who have already seen their purchasing power cut in half by currency devaluation. The money flows in from Washington and flows straight back out to the banks that made the original loans. Greece understood this with devastating clarity. When Greece received its first bailout in 2010, 110 billion euros from the IMF, European Commission, and European Central Bank, Greek officials were initially told the package was to stabilize Greece. What it was, in practice, was a mechanism to ensure that French and German banks, which had lent heavily to the Greek government, did not have to recognize losses on those loans. By 2015, an audit conducted for the Greek parliament found that 89% of the first bailout had gone not to the Greek economy, but to repay financial institutions. Greek citizens got the austerity. European banks got their money back. The IMF, to its credit, later admitted in a 2013 internal evaluation that it had underestimated the fiscal multiplier, which is economist language for, we did not realize that cutting spending this aggressively would cause the economy to shrink this fast. Greece's GDP contracted by 27% between 2008 and 2013. Unemployment peaked at 27.5%. Youth unemployment hit 60%. The death rate rose 3 times faster than in Western Europe overall. An internal IMF evaluation acknowledged the program had serious design flaws. This acknowledgement was published after the damage was complete. The second thing to know, the prescription is almost always the same, regardless of the patient. Cut government spending. Raise taxes. Liberalize capital markets. Privatize state-owned assets. Raise interest rates. Reduce subsidies. These conditions, packaged together as structural adjustment programs from the 1980s onwards, have been applied to countries as different as Jamaica and Indonesia, Argentina and Zambia, Thailand and Egypt. The same conditions, repackaged under different names across different decades, applied to wildly different economies with wildly different problems, producing results that the IMF's own internal evaluations have repeatedly described as mixed at best. In 1997, when the Asian financial crisis hit, Thailand, South Korea, and Indonesia all turned to the IMF. All three had been growing at between 8 and 12% of GDP annually for years. The crisis was not caused by reckless government spending. It was caused by a sudden reversal of private capital flows, hot money that had flooded in during the boom years and left just as fast when sentiment shifted. The correct response, argued Stiglitz and Sachs at the time, was to lower interest rates to support growth and manage the capital outflow carefully. The IMF's response was to demand higher interest rates, spending cuts, and rapid financial sector liberalization. Short-term rates in Indonesia jumped to 80%. Businesses that had been profitable for decades suddenly could not service their loans. Mass bankruptcies followed. Unemployment exploded. Real wages across the affected countries fell between 20 and 30% in a matter of months. The IMF had diagnosed a private sector liquidity crisis and prescribed the austerity medicine appropriate for a government spending crisis. The patient and the disease had nothing in common. The medicine was administered anyway. Jeffrey Sachs, writing in the Financial Times as the crisis deepened, was nearly incandescent. 3 months before South Korea required an IMF bailout, the IMF's own annual report had described Korea's macroeconomic performance as impressive and praised the authorities for their enviable fiscal record. 3 months later, the same institution was imposing emergency conditions as if Korea had been recklessly mismanaged for years. Sachs called it overkill. He was being measured. The third thing to know, the same countries keep coming back, which raises a question the IMF has never satisfactorily answered. Between 1980 and 1999, Argentina received 30 separate adjustment loans from the IMF and World Bank. 30. If structural adjustment programs reliably produced the stable, growing economies they promised, Argentina would have needed 1, or perhaps 2, and then moved on. 30 programs in 20 years is not a rescue operation. It is a subscription service. Jamaica has been in and out of IMF programs for most of its existence as an independent nation, entering its first program in 1977 and returning with such regularity that Jamaican economists have described the relationship as a permanent condition rather than a temporary intervention. Pakistan has entered IMF agreements 17 times since 1958. Zambia entered its first IMF program in 1973. By 2020, it had entered more than 15. Each time, the conditions are broadly the same. Each time, the promised growth and stability either fails to materialize or appears briefly before the next crisis arrives, requiring another loan on another set of conditions. A panel study published in the Journal of Development Economics, examining IMF program participation across 98 countries between 1970 and 2000, found that IMF programs reduced economic growth rates in participating countries when the statistical endogeneity of program selection was properly accounted for. The IMF has disputed this methodology. The countries that have lived through multiple programs have lived through the results. The fourth thing to know, the conditions routinely stripped governments of the tools they needed to actually recover. Capital market liberalization, the requirement that countries remove controls on the flow of money in and out of the economy, was a standard IMF condition from the 1980s through to the early 2000s. The logic was that free capital flows would attract investment and improve efficiency. The reality, in multiple documented cases, was that liberalizing capital flows before a country had the regulatory infrastructure to manage them opened the door to devastating capital flight the moment confidence wobbled. When the IMF intervened in Kenya in the early 1990s, one of the conditions was that the central bank remove its controls over capital flows. The result was what became known as the Goldenberg Scandal, a mechanism by which politically connected figures were able to move money out of the country with a freedom they had not previously enjoyed. The Kenyan economy did not benefit from the capital it had liberalized. It benefited the people who moved it abroad. The IMF later acknowledged that capital account liberalization needed to be carefully sequenced. This acknowledgement came after decades of conditioning loans on rapid liberalization in countries that lacked the institutions to manage it. Malaysia, during the same 1997 Asian crisis, chose not to take the IMF's advice. Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad imposed capital controls, exactly what the IMF said a country should never do, pegged the ringgit to the dollar, and refused an IMF program entirely. The Wall Street Journal editorial board called the capital controls desperate and mindless. The Economist warned that Malaysia was taking a big gamble. Malaysia recovered faster than Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea, all of which had followed IMF prescriptions. By 2000, Malaysia's GDP per capita had returned to pre-crisis levels. Indonesia, which had followed the IMF program most closely, took until 2005 to reach the same milestone. Mahathir was not awarded a Nobel Prize. The IMF did not issue a formal apology. But the IMF did, in subsequent years, quietly revise its position on capital controls, acknowledging that in certain circumstances they could be appropriate. The revision came without fanfare. Mahathir's name was not mentioned in it. The fifth thing to know, the IMF's governance structure means it consistently serves the interests of its largest shareholders, and those shareholders are not the countries that end up needing rescues. Voting power at the IMF is allocated by economic size, meaning the United States holds the largest single share at approximately 16.5%, giving it an effective veto over major decisions that require an 85% supermajority. The G7 nations collectively control enough votes to block any policy direction they oppose. Sub-Saharan Africa, a region of 54 countries with a combined population exceeding 1.4 billion people, holds less than 5% of IMF voting power. These are, notably, the countries that most frequently need IMF assistance and that have historically had the least ability to negotiate the terms of the programs attached to it. Jeffrey Sachs put a number on the imbalance in 1997 when he wrote that a small group of 1,000 economists on 19th Street in Washington was dictating the economic conditions of life to 75 developing countries with around 1.4 billion people. The address has not changed. The voting structure has not meaningfully changed either. The 2010 governance reform, which modestly increased the voting weight of emerging economies, was the most significant structural adjustment the IMF has applied to itself. It took 66 years. This structural reality has a practical consequence. When the IMF demands that a developing country liberalize trade, the industries that benefit from that liberalization are frequently those in the wealthier member states that dominate IMF governance. When the IMF demands privatization of state-owned enterprises, the buyers of those assets are frequently multinationals headquartered in those same wealthy countries. When the IMF demands rapid financial sector opening, the financial institutions that gain access are overwhelmingly Western banks. None of this requires a conspiracy. It requires only that the institution's incentive structure consistently aligns with the interests of its most powerful members, which is exactly what Stiglitz was describing when he said the IMF was reflecting the interests and ideology of the Western financial community. In 2018, Argentina received the largest IMF loan in the institution's history at that point, $57 billion. The conditions were the same ones that had failed Argentina before: austerity, fiscal tightening, monetary contraction. The IMF's own assessment acknowledged the debt was sustainable, but not with high probability. The loan was approved regardless. GDP fell. Unemployment rose past 27%. The peso lost more than half its value against the dollar in 2018 alone. By 2019, Argentina was back in crisis. In 2020, it defaulted for the 9th time in its history. It was Argentina's third default since receiving IMF loans, and its second default on an IMF loan specifically. The IMF later acknowledged it had underestimated the economic damage its prescribed conditions would cause. It used almost exactly the same words it had used after Greece, after Indonesia, after Zambia, after Kenya. The institution that prides itself on rigorous economic forecasting has, with impressive consistency, been surprised by the results of its own programs in countries across 4 continents over 4 decades. So here is what the record shows. The IMF was built to be a fire brigade. What it became, across 80 years of interventions on 6 continents, is an institution that arrives after the fire has started, charges the homeowner for the water, requires that they sell their furniture as a condition of receiving it, and then publishes a careful internal review 3 years. Later noting that the furniture had some residual value and that the water pressure may have been set slightly too high. The countries that ignored its prescriptions, Malaysia in 1997, Iceland after 2008, which chose bank failure over socializing bank debt and recovered within 3 years, while Ireland, which took the IMF's advice, spent a decade paying for it, frequently did. Better than the countries that accepted them. The countries that accepted them the most, that signed the most agreements, that submitted to the most conditions over the most years, frequently found themselves signing the next agreement not long after. 30 programs in Argentina in 20 years, 17 in Pakistan across 60 years, Jamaica still in the cycle, Zambia still in the cycle. There is a paper trail. It is not hidden. The IMF publishes its internal evaluations. It acknowledges its underestimated multipliers, its premature capital liberalization, its unrealistic growth forecasts, the programs that worsened the crises they were designed to resolve. The acknowledgments are thorough. The institutional changes that follow them are modest. And the next program, in the next country, is built on foundations that look remarkably like the ones that just failed somewhere else. Every economic crisis has a paper trail. History just knows where to look. And so do you now. I'm Malcolm. This is History Meets Economics. Subscribe now. If you think this documentary is wrong, explain where. If you think it's right, explain. Here's another moment where history met economics.